I'm in the business so I can help young men and women become proud, strong citizens, loving their country when it's right and earnestly trying to change it when it's wrong. Is that indoctrination? If that's indoctrination, I'll plead guilty to it. But I don't think you can teach any subject blandly or without any kind of conviction.
Universally, Mr. Wasser was beloved. I mean, he was the teacher that everybody hoped they got. His classroom was the place where you could disagree and were actually encouraged that people have different opinions. And it was a safe place where you could just say what you felt. And people did. It was a remarkable class. And it's one of my all-time favorite experiences being in his class.
I would always try to find my way to stand next to the minority opinion. Always stand close to that man or woman who's standing up and arguing for principle. And I would tell them, you might be one person facing a hurricane, but you've got to have strong roots. You have to have the courage of your convictions. And these are your friends. They're still your friends. And don't worry about being in the minority. That's going to happen in life.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Teacher Stories and Courageous Conversations about our schools. My name is Ken Futernick, and as you may know, I host both of these podcasts, and from time to time, we post new episodes on both of them, which is what is the case today. In today's conversation with my guest, Bruce Wasser, you'll hear a fascinating and at times agonizing story about a decision he made when he was a young adult back in the 60s during the Vietnam War. Bruce would later become a teacher who taught history, including the era that proved to be such an important time in his life. Mr. Wasser, as I expect his students called him, was part of the history lessons he taught to his students. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Thank you very much for having me, Ken. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being part of this and for writing such a wonderful book. Before I have you share your story, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and where you live.
Well, Ken, I live with my wife, the author Fern Schumer Chapman, in Northern Illinois. And after a 33-year career in teaching, I live a retired life. I'm still active. I officiate 4 sports. And I work with students who are crafting their essays to get into college.
Do you happen to work with kids playing basketball?
Yes, I ruin their lives, Ken, just as I try to destroy the lives of playing baseball, softball, and volleyball.
Well, it's a little story that's going to come back later about basketball. So I just wanted to find out if you were still involved in that sport, and it turns out you are.
I sure am.
Let me say just a little bit more for our audience. Bruce is the author of a new book titled 90, A Conscientious Objector's Journey of Quiet Resistance. 90 refers to the number randomly selected in the draft lottery back then to see who would be called into service. The book really resonated for me, Bruce, not only because of its connection to teaching, but because you describe in wonderful and sometimes painful detail a time in my life when I was 18 years old back in 1971. I recall very vividly being away at college, sitting in my dorm room in Colorado, listening to the radio with a bunch of other 18-year-old boys, or young men, I suppose, as birth dates and draft numbers were being read over the radio. We all knew that if your number was low, you'd be drafted and probably be sent off to fight a war in Vietnam. My number was 165, which turned out to be high enough to keep me out of the draft. That was not the case for you, Bruce. I want to introduce another very special guest, Julia Damer. Julie was a student of Bruce's a number of years ago, back in the 80s, several decades ago. Julie, I want to welcome you to the show. It's great to have you join us today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So the two of you have stayed in touch through the years, right? This isn't like a reunion after 30 or 40 years. But Julia, you've been in touch with Bruce and his wife through these many years.
I have. I don't think I've ever not been in touch. Bruce was at my wedding. He was, I have great pictures of the two of us at my high school graduation. Through the years, he's just been there.
So I'm going to bring you back, Julia, after we hear from Bruce, who's going to share a very short version of a story that I urge listeners to read. It's available at Amazon, and I gave the title before. But I'm going to ask you to go back to the beginning of the story, Bruce, and just walk us through what you wrote about in this wonderful book that you have written.
90 is an exploration of a young man coming of age. That's I. I came of age at a time when America was in extraordinary turmoil. Turmoil from a war that was unpopular, many felt misguided, even more felt was immoral. I came of age at a time of tremendous social idealism as well. The idealism of the civil rights movement, of a time when politicians could inspire people to works, a time where we felt that the world could be changed for the better. I had a wonderful high school education in a public school in San Diego, an extraordinary middle-class school that taught Mandarin Chinese and had professors from community colleges come in and teach us. There I began what would be a lifelong devotion to my teachers. For some reason or another, I have always been drawn to teachers. My beloved father, who passed away when I was 15, was an extraordinary teacher. He was my baseball skipper, or we would now call a coach. And from him, I learned the lessons of hard work, of the dignity of competition, of fair play. Even more, he taught me the meaning and the desperate need for equality. My mom instilled in me a love of learning, of reading. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was very much enmeshed in the life of my school. Your listeners might be interested in knowing that it was not only a teacher, but a coach and a counselor who would have really a profound influence on my life. His name was Richard C. Dick Eiler. He was my basketball coach. I made the team as a junior, Ken, for reasons I only late in my life understood. I was horrible. There must have been 100 young men in the school who could beat me one-on-one in ball. I was awful. But Coach Eiler found a place for me on the team. I was the last player on the end of the bench, but absorbing my father's lessons, I felt as if I were in every game. I realized later in my life that my father saw me play only once. And after the game, he was involved in a very intense conversation with Coach Eiler. I had no idea what it was about. I was a sophomore, bewildered. I knew my father was very sick at the time. I think my dad told Coach Eiler that he was dying. And he asked this teacher to look after his son. Eiler kept me on the team. He knew I would have something to contribute. I did. I became the first most inspirational player in the school's history. They never had an award before that. I tried so hard to be part of the team. I was a diligent student, but not a particularly bright one, Ken. And I wanted to have the opportunity to go to college. And I beseeched the scholarship advisor at our school if she would take me under her wing. She declined, telling me that my test scores, the PSAT, were not high enough. It was one of the few times in my life where I actually spoke back to a teacher, not in anger, but in disappointment. And I told her respectfully, I understand. I understand you won't counsel me and guide me for college, but I'm going to get into college, I told her. And when I do, and when scholarships are announced at our school's awards assembly, it's going to be my counselor who's going to do the announcements and not you.
Mm.
My counselor was my coach, who had all the non-winning seniors, the ones that didn't do well on the tests. Coach Eiler was their counselor. I was in his batch. And I did get into many colleges. And Coach Eiler did have the wonderful opportunity on awards night to announce my scholarships. Eiler would have a big part in my life, as I'll describe in a few minutes. When I went to Princeton in 1968, I was shattered by the dual assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Those assassinations occurred within 60 days of one another. It is hard to describe the stunning impact those deaths had on the nation and certainly on me personally. The year before, I had dutifully enrolled in the selective service system. I signed up for the draft. But like most kids who were going to school, I took out a student deferment, never thinking really about what the consequences of that would be. In the summer of 68, after Robert Kennedy's assassination, I went to the local draft board and made application to become a conscientious objector. That is, a man, at that time it was only men, whose conscience did not permit him to engage in acts of war. I didn't think much about it. I thought it was the only way I could practically renounce violence and show my opposition to the war. I maintained my student deferment, a decision even now at the age of 76 I regret. Every year I continued my student deferment. There were men who had to don the uniforms of our country, who paid the sacrifice sometimes of grievous injury, even death, while I was studying at Princeton. It wasn't until 1969, when the draft occurred, when the first lottery occurred, that I realized I was going to have to bear the burden of my decision. That chaotic night must seem so strange to a modern generation where information is instantaneous. You have it in your hand. But back then, we didn't know what our numbers would be. We had to scramble to get a TV or a radio, and the message, it was chaotic. I found that my number was 90. And that December night, I knew that I was going to have to make real my need to prove to a draft board that I was a conscientious objector. 90 was a low number. It was a loser's number, and I had it. I was Jewish. I am Jewish. There is no conscientious objection for Judaism. I had to face a mother whose heart was broken over the loss of her husband, who felt that it was a shame that I would not be in the military, who invoked my father's name against me in her opposition. In order to prove conscientious objection, Ken, a candidate must prove sincerity, thoroughness of belief, and consistency of belief. In order to do that, I had to elicit letters from students, from professors who knew me. Well, most of the letter writers, Ken, agreed with me. Princeton at that time was a relatively liberal school. My student friends were almost all liberal. They all hated the war. Of course, they're going to write letters for me. Would my local draft board feel that that was an accurate representation of my sincere opposition to war? Now, I have to say, and I'll take a step back in saying this, there were other options available. Many men in my generation felt that they could not abide living in the United States and went to other countries. I could never do that. I am profoundly, deeply American. I love this nation passionately. I could never abandon the country that welcomed my forebears, that was a refuge against their oppression. I would never leave the country. Other young men came up or fabricated medical excuses. I didn't dislike them. I felt confused by them. I felt tormented that they sometimes would abuse their bodies or use privilege or position to find a way to exempt themselves from military obligation. I would never do that. In San Diego, a conservative area, I had no chance of getting this status. I wasn't religious, and I was terrified. I think I felt legitimately that I was going to go to jail. That after graduation, that's where I would end up. Leavenworth was the prison that I felt I would end up in. And I was terrified. I shouldn't have been. I had a professor who was the shining light of my life, Martin Duberman, who, in a beautiful talk with me, tried to say many good people have been in jail, Bruce. You shouldn't feel afraid to go there. And he understood I was terrified, that I might be ashamed to my parents. If I went to jail, I couldn't become an attorney. Well, needless to say, Martin wrote a lovely letter for me. But the letter that was pivotal, Ken, I think pivotal in the same way that Coach Eiler somehow had a pivotal role in me getting into Princeton. I think if I had Coach Eiler write a letter for me, that it might be a determining factor in having the draft board grant its application. Princeton was going to go on strike in the spring of 1970. Instead of engaging in strike activities, I determined to meet Coach Eiler in of all places, West Point, where he was participating in a school's conference. So I made an arrangement to meet Coach Eiler in West Point, the bastion of American military might, and try to persuade him to change his mind about the war, and perhaps then think about writing a letter for me to the local draft board. I'd like to read, if I may, a section from my book that is the dialogue between Coach Eiler and me. I know you don't agree with me. I try to look Coach in the eye, but he's gazing off, as if he's staring at the kids sitting on the bench wearing too tight bottoms. As a 13th player, I got the only uniforms left, an extra small. In the locker room, my teammates would time me to see how long it took to squeeze into my shorts. I press on. But I want to stop this war, and instead of protesting, I thought maybe it would help if I could change one person's mind about Vietnam. So I'd like to talk to you about your position. I know how much you support the president and how much you care about America. Listen, young man, he bristles, his tone a mixture of anger and paternity. He's already shaking a finger at me as if he were reprimanding me back in high school. I know you, but I don't know why you've made this decision. Coach, my voice cracks as I try to gather my thoughts. You would turn your back on the country that has done so much for you? Eiler talks right over me, obviously as passionate about the war as I am. I see young people on the streets spitting on the flag, burning the draft cards. It makes me sick. Sitting through this won't be easy, I think, but I tell myself I stood up to my mother, and I can do it here. Coach, after Dad died, I say, trying to steady myself, something has sort of broke inside of me. Then after Martin and Bobby were murdered, I knew I could never go to war. I knew that other guys applying for CO status have other motivations, but my reason comes from a broken heart and a commitment to nonviolence. Look, number 11, he says, and suddenly I'm 17 years old again, sitting on the bench, smelling the sweat and hearing the cheers from the stands. Only Eiler has ever called me number 11. What he doesn't understand is that I'm not 17 anymore. I'm 21 years old, and a different number, 90, now defines and drives me. It makes me sad to hear you talk this way. All of us have sorrows and pain, but there's no reason to turn your back on America, Eiler pauses, his steely gray eyes burn into me, and I see his recalcitrance in it. When you were on my team, I knew exactly what to expect of you. You, more than anyone else, knew what it meant to sacrifice for others, he says, as if he's rallying our squad in the locker room. You always put the team above everything else. You never gave in to selfishness, and you always gave me unqualified support, even when I made decisions that confused or upset you. That's exactly what this country's asking of you now. Eiler hammers home his point. You may not like the president. You may hate the war, but a patriot never questions authority. He does what's asked of him without reservations. Coach, I interrupt him, trying hard not to sound as nervous as I feel. I love this country, but it's ruining itself. Seems to me a good patriot always questions what's right or wrong. I had hoped you would see the cost of this war, that it's not winnable. It's not right. He shakes his head in disgust. Bruce, I don't know what's happened to you. He points at my faded Princeton sweatshirt, my well-worn jeans, disheveled hair. Of all the boys on the team, I thought better of you. I thought you would do what your country asks. I talked to your father when he was dying. We discussed our backgrounds, our histories. Then it hits me. Maybe in that last conversation, Dad told Eiler he was dying and asked Coach to take care of me. If Eiler agreed, and he surely would have, that explains why he kept me on the team. He was very proud of his military record, Eiler goes on. It hurts me to say this, Bruce. Coach pauses, drops his gaze into his lap, as if he's debating with himself whether he should go on. Then he raises his eyes, looks at me straight on, and says what he's thinking. No father could have been prouder of his son than he was. But your dad would be worried about you now. He wouldn't agree with you. I doubt you would have changed his mind about the war, and you won't change mine either. Another strange silence divides us, and we both shift uncomfortably in our chairs. Coach, I say softly after some times, thanks for listening to me. I don't know if you realize it, but I still play ball every day, and I think of you every time I step on the court. I'm sorry I've disappointed you. You can always change your mind, Bruce. America is calling, and she needs the most inspirational player on her side. That cuts deeply, but I clench my teeth and tell myself to hold my ground. You're too good a man to abandon your country in this place, Eiler adds with a flourish, spreading his arms wide to encompass the martial spirit of West Point and the Grand Thayer Hotel. I've listened to my own heart, I say slowly to my coach, surprised to hear how confident I sound. Then, to underscore my conviction, I add, even when it hurts those I admire most. Promise me, Bruce, you'll think about what I've said. Keep in touch with me. Don't stop writing letters to me. Coach, I hope you'll keep an open mind too. Forcing a smile, even though my heart is in my stomach, I try to lighten the tone. And maybe one day, you'll even replace that flag pin on your lapel with a peace button. I can't believe I said that. And I smile at the man I love. It would be my privilege to send you one.
I'm so glad you read that part of the book. I was really touched by that story. And of course, there's more to the story that is going to come in a moment. But as I recall, you weren't totally surprised by that reaction. You knew he was perhaps conservative, but it had to be pretty devastating to have him essentially reject what you had decided was such an important decision on your part.
Ken, I have always felt, and this became a guiding principle to my years in the classroom, that there is almost a sacred relationship between a teacher and his or her students, a bond that is hard for the non-teaching public to understand. Coach Eiler was my teacher. He was, unfortunately, he's passed away. He was extremely important to me. And to have a teacher on my side as I'm fighting really the greatest battle in my life, the battle to prove to the land I love that I'm worthy of being designated a conscientious objector, that was extremely important to me. And that was the that was the guiding lesson of my life, that teachers have the most profound responsibilities. And I had the great fortune of teaching adolescents and teenagers who are in an enormous turmoil in most of their young lives. I think see their teachers in many ways as parental figures. Even if they're young, even if they're only 10 years older, they still are kind of parental figures. And these parental figures can exert extraordinary influence. It's rather humbling, uh, Ken. And and I became a conscientious objector.
But before you were granted that status, as I recall, someone from the draft board contacted you and said, your case is going to be reviewed soon. You need another letter. You need someone who can vouch for your authenticity. And the idea of contacting your coach came up, but I think you thought that that was a losing proposition. He had already declared his opposition to what you wanted to do, but you asked him anyway.
Yes.
And uh, I just want to read something that he said, a little bit of it, because I was so moved by it. And the fact that you ended your conversation with him at West Point, he had asked you to think about what he had said, and you said you would, and then you had the gumption to say, "I hope you'll think about what I said, Coach." And apparently he did. And this is what he writes, as I recall, or as I wrote down to the draft board in his letter vouching for you. He says, "During these years, Bruce related strong inner feelings about violence and war. Upon high school graduation, and as each college year concluded, I saw a reinforced feeling against all war and related activities. I am convinced now, upon graduation from college, he is totally and honestly a legitimate objector to involvement in any war." And I have to believe, well, certainly that letter had to mean a lot to you, but it might have actually made the difference in you being granted CO status, right?
I have no question about that at all. Coach Eiler got me into Princeton. Coach Eiler got me to become a conscientious objector. This very conservative Latter-day Saint, who was the model of conservative propriety, embraces this liberal Jewish kid, puts him on his team, gets him into college, and has him become a CO.
Mm.
Now, if that isn't the influence of a teacher on a young person's life, I don't know what is.
But what's really a wonderful thing I just want to note here about being a teacher, I was a teacher for many years myself, is that yes, teachers have profound influence on many of their students, but students have a profound influence on their teachers. And I suspect when we hear from Julia in a few minutes, um, if she talks about her experience in your class, you will have something to say about that the influence she had on you. And I think you had an influence on Coach Eiler when you asked him to think about what you had said. Clearly, he had thought about it and he came back and decided to write that letter. So it goes both ways.
Well, thank you for saying that. I believe so.
So you applied to law school at Stanford. I think you wanted to become a civil rights lawyer. And just explain briefly why you decided not to go to Stanford.
Well, I think the decision, unfortunately, was made for me. Uh, Stanford refused to grant, first of all, I was granted conscientious objector status. I was the first non-religious CO in San Diego's history. I didn't have to go to Leavenworth, and I was going to go to Stanford Law. But I knew I could not enroll in the fall of 1971, as my draft number was 90. The number was called. And so I did alternate service work for 2 years. I respectfully asked Stanford if I could gain automatic readmission 2 years hence, and the University Law School declined and said I could reapply. There were any number of categories where the automatic readmission would have been granted. Uh, Being a SEAL was not one of them. I felt it was discriminatory, ironically, a terrible violation of due process, certainly not one of equal justice. And so I, for 2 years, felt that perhaps law was not going to be the answer. And during the 2 years where I was working as a laboratory glassware washer, I determined that education might be the best path for me to take in life. And it was the better road taken.
Yeah, so that's a wonderful spot for me to read something that you wrote in the afterword of your book, because you don't really talk about your career as a teacher until the very end of the book. And now we get to talk a little bit about that. And what's really special about what we're going to do now is we get to hear from one of your students. But let me just share with our listeners something you wrote in the afterword about uh, your career as a teacher. You say my most significant societal contribution, reflecting my dedication to protest and resistance, was becoming a teacher. In my classroom, surrounded by my beloved students, I worked every single day at encouraging these young people to find their own voices, to stand for principle, to be unafraid to challenge wrong. I felt obligated to help them become compassionate and empathetic, dedicated citizens. Every teacher enters a classroom with an agenda. Mine was to bend the moral arc of the universe closer to justice. What a wonderful uh, few sentences that you put together there, Bruce, and it just so fitting for what this podcast is about, teacher stories, and trying to get students and teachers to remember why they got into the profession in the first place. And I've not heard many people say it better than that. But Julie, I want to bring you back. Thanks for being patient and listening to Bruce's story. I've read his story. I know you have too, and it just, I know both you and I enjoyed hearing him say it rather than just reading it. And but what was it like? If going back, decades as best you can recall, what was it like being one of, well, we'll call him Bruce. I'm sure back then you called him Mr. Wasser. What was it like being one of his students?
It still feels strange calling him Bruce, and it's been so almost 40 years, but I have to force myself to call him Bruce. But to go back, Mr. Wasser was, he was the activities director when I first entered high school. So, and I was in leadership, so I knew him before he was my teacher. He was the person who was the faculty director for the leadership group. And going in as a freshman, you just universally, Mr. Wasser was beloved. I mean, he was the teacher that everybody hoped they got. And by the time I had him as my teacher for US history junior year, I was already really familiar with him. And his classroom was, well, it was laid out in an unusual way for the time. We're talking 1988. It was laid out in a semicircle, in an arc, so that people in the class could see each other. We could have a discourse that was easy, and he would be in the center for the most part, unless there was a lesson where he brought people in the middle. It was a place where you could disagree, and were actually it was encouraged that people have different opinions, and it was a safe place where you could just say what you felt, and people did. And there was a lot of, I remember there was a lot of acrimony. We were meant to be forming our opinions, and it, to look back, it was really a safe space. Everyone there felt, I would say, I'm going to speak for everybody, felt pretty comfortable saying what they wanted to, and having unpopular opinion counter to Mr. Wasser's. Uh, it was a remarkable class, and it's one of my all-time favorite experiences being in his class. And um, I don't know if I don't think Bruce has talked about, but his programs of conscience that he started. I can't remember going back this far if he was worked in tandem, but I believe this was mostly his idea. Was the program of conscience was a week long, probably longer than that, but it was a week long program where he brought uh, Fred Korematsu was there. People from the JACL. We were talking about internment. We were talking about the Holocaust. So people got up who had experienced the internment camps, and we would talk about it as it got closer to the 1988 election. We had debates. We had the Bush side and we had the Dukakis side, and we would have an auditorium full of our fellow students, and we would pick a side and we would debate them. That was 1988, and we weren't able to vote yet, but we were encouraged to have opinions and to be able to back them up, and it was just an amazing time.
Mm.
And I really can't stress the programs of conscience enough. I don't know if they still have it at our high school, but I wish they would, because that was really just something that stuck with me. And
Mm.
how could it not? It's an entire program.
Julia, is there one lesson that just sort of stuck with you that you took away from Mr. Wasser's class that you still has some influence on the way you live your life today?
It was a bunch of different things. I remember when everybody was, when there were differing opinions, some were not popular. Bruce would get up and say, "I may not agree with you, but I will fight to the death for your right to say your opinion."
Hmm.
That always stuck with me. Um, I know he was quoting someone, but that is the first I'd heard that. Maybe he wasn't quoting someone, but it- those definitely stuck with me. As you just heard, he's very eloquent and very earnest and passionate, and all of those qualities came out in his in his teaching, and it was really it never really felt like you were in class. It felt like you were learning, but you weren't. It was a different way of teaching that we hadn't. It was novel, just to have a free flowing of ideas, have lessons um, that really caught home. Now that you've asked that question, I do remember we had a slave ship um, lesson, and Bruce he had a diagram on the floor in the center of the little arc I was telling you about. And to get an idea of how much space there was on the slave ships, we lied down and we were able to see how many bodies would fit in that area. And that's a lesson that I don't know that you could do today, but it's a lesson that stayed with me for 40 years. When you talk about the Middle Passage, and you really want to drive home viscerally what people are feeling, seeing, you know
Mm.
obviously you're getting an idea mostly of the confines of the space, but it's one thing to be lying down next to somebody and realize that you don't have any room to move at all,
Yeah.
and you're going to be in that position for months.
So thank you for that, Julia. Bruce, this must bring back some wonderful memories about teaching at that time, but also memories of having Julia as a student. What do you recall about Julia as a student? I know this is going back a few decades, but I know you've stayed in touch, and I have to believe that you have recollections about her as a student.
Well, certainly I do, Ken. Uh, I was never blessed with having daughters, and I've always thought that Julia would was like a daughter to me. I loved her like a daughter. I tried to love all of my students. It sounds like a strange word to say. Schools, teachers need to love their kids. And that means they can drive their kids hard. They can push them to learn things that might be painful, that there's a struggle to learning. but I would always tell my kids that you're going to have teachers that are a lot brighter than me, but you're not going to have anybody that's going to love you as much as I'll love you. I'm going to love you so much that I'm going to take you to places that are very painful, that are tough, tough to learn about. Julia was an extraordinarily gifted student. Now, does that mean she was the brightest student? No, but she was the gift. She had a conscience. She had an extraordinarily well-developed sense of wrong and right. She had unusual qualities of compassion and empathy. What teacher would not want to have a 17-year-old who's like that in their classroom? She spoke, it's as if lightning would come out of her mouth, but in a gentle way. She was listened to very carefully. The classroom that I tried to develop, I think, was a very safe place. And Ken, one of the reasons I think it was is that I was a very old-fashioned teacher. That I loved my school. They knew who I was. It's not like I lived in some other city. And they all knew, I mean, when I say they, I think every student in my class knew I was on the left, and they could care less about it. If sometimes a kid would ask, well, what do you think about this, Mr. Wasser? And that student, when they say, no, no, don't waste our time. We already know what he thinks about it. It's not like a surprise. So it was a very safe place. I recall at that time when the kids, they used to call it beefing, when they get in arguments with each other, I would always try to find my way to stand next to the minority opinion. Always stand close to that man or woman who's standing up and arguing for principle. And I would tell them, you might be one person facing a hurricane, but you've got to have strong roots. You have to have the courage of your convictions. And these are your friends. They're still your friends. And don't worry about being in the minority. That's going to happen in life. So that would be, I recall Julia's essays. They were beautifully written. They were passionately argued. And so I think Julia came out of my class in American history with an abiding love for her land, a tormented love, a love that would say it's a love that's so deep that it would want to change what's wrong, cherish the ideals. Kids, young men and women, boy, are they aware of the difference between the ideal and the real. They really know the difference between that. They know they want to be adult, but they're not quite adult. They know that tension. Well, that's the same tension we have in our culture between our ideals of liberty and equality and our realities of inequality and poverty and cruelty. And so we have to, as a history teacher, I want to make the kids feel that they have an obligation to make right what is wrong, to make whole what is broken.
Bruce, I so appreciate you sharing those sentiments about what Julia meant to you, what teaching meant to you. The narrative we hear about teaching today, unfortunately, is not that narrative as much as it should be. It's what's wrong with schools. Teachers are not appreciated to the extent that they should, and people thinking about what they're going to do for a career usually doesn't have those sentiments as part of their calculus. It's there are other things and all the reasons why you might not want to do it. But so thank you for that. And I know there are people listening to this, that are teaching, that will be thankful for those words. It will remind them that what they're doing is important. I hope people that have not yet chosen a career or in a career that maybe is not as satisfying or important to them as they'd like will hear those words and think, maybe I will become a teacher. But what I want to do now is, Julia, ask you, what did What do Bruce's words mean to you now that you've heard them about being his student all these years later? What does that mean to you?
Well, it's very sweet and it's hard. I was hearing, listening to him and I thought, this almost sounds like he's at my funeral because we've, we don't really, it's easy for me to think about what I think about him, but to think about what he thinks of me is something I've never actually thought about. Um, it didn't ever seem reciprocal, because he means so much to me. And of course, he's always told me how much he loves me. And I had that feeling as many students did when they were in his classroom. As he mentioned, he did give his phone number. People did know where he lived. We went to his house and we watched the actual returns from the election of 1988 and 1992. And, I mean, it was, if his classroom was a safe space, his home was a safe space for us as well. He had and has a way of just making people feel loved. And he has no problem telling people. It's just whether or not your brain can penetrate that, it can get in there. Um, Bruce is just, the way he was speaking about Coach Eiler and Martin Duberman is how I feel about him. I mean, I think if you're fortunate, you have a person who has been your guiding light and the formative presence in your life from when your personality and your being were just we're being molded. And if I can look back, he is the one person I would say who has left a lasting imprint on my life about the way I look at the world, looking at things through a moral lens, and has it passed the Bruce test? It's always there. It's always in the back of my mind.
So there's one last item I want to run by both of you, and this is sort of relevant to the other podcast I do, Courageous Conversations about our schools. And one of the things that's occurred in recent years is that the teachers have been accused by some of indoctrinating their students, pushing their own agenda onto their students. And so I think when they heard me read the words from your afterword, Bruce, that I want them to find their own voices, to stand for principle, to bend the moral arc of the universe closer to justice. I suspect some people listening to that might think, wait, hold on, this is a slippery slope. I think what history teachers ought to do is teach the facts and keep their opinions to themselves. And yet, what I heard you say, Bruce, so beautifully when you talked about how passionate and committed you were to the idea of free speech. You said, I deeply embrace the First Amendment's protections of expression. I had thought that everyone on the left shared my view. Not anymore, I guess. You were disappointed with people on the left because while they seemed to be advocates for free speech, when it came to speech that they didn't like, they suddenly stopped being advocates for free speech. But just relating this to what you did as a teacher and what you said a few minutes ago, when there was someone in your class that held a minority position, you would go stand by them, give them support, and encourage them to express that because you wanted them not to believe what you believed, but to find their own voice and to stand up for it, even if it wasn't what you thought. Did I get that right?
Well, yes, you did. Uh, I don't want to sound cavalier about the idea of indoctrinating, but I believe every person enters a job, any job, with a set of expectations and perceptions about that job. And the best they can do is to be frank and honest about it. I always kept, believe it or not, a very small part of an index card in my wallet that listed why I'm teaching. I had to know why I'm teaching. Every man or woman who enters a classroom has to know that and at least be frank about their own biases, their own perceptions. Of course, I wanted them to challenge racism and prejudice and evil. My own lives, I saw lives scarred by it. We are living in a time where quantifiable results dominate teachers' landscape. It was not so when I was a younger man, when I was in a classroom. But somehow we have to find the courage to say, yes, I am teaching American history because I want to teach American culture and the American character. And that culture and character is a mosaic. It's not monochromatic. It's not one color. It's not all good. Kids know that. You ask a teenager, if you give teenagers pablum, they're going to spit it back at you. That's the honest to God truth. Or they'll memorize it so they can get a score on a test and then ignore it the day the class is over and not remember a damn thing. Oh, I didn't enter teaching for that purpose. I didn't enter teaching so that I could say I want my kids to get a 4 on an AP test. That's not why I'm in the business. I'm in the business so I can help young men and women become proud, strong citizens, loving their country when it's right and earnestly trying to change it when it's wrong. Is that indoctrination? If that's indoctrination, I'll plead guilty to it. But I don't think you can teach any subject blandly or without any kind of conviction. And so my students knew my bias and they didn't care. It was irrelevant to them. And they would say, well, they were never worried about, is he going to be prejudiced against me? Am I going to get a bad grade because I'm supporting this candidate or I don't agree with it? They never, it just didn't happen. My Judaic heritage certainly shows up in the temples in which I grew up. There is an inscription on the ark in which the Torah is kept. And I always learned it in the old-fashioned language. Know before whom thou art standing. And that's on my card. Every class was different. I had an idea of where I wanted to go, but I knew before whom I was standing. And it's very, very humbling. It's really humbling. These are young men and women, both middle school and high school, who, in many instances, come from homes where there is insufficient validation. In simple language, they aren't loved enough. They aren't cherished enough. They aren't told how precious they are. And I think more than any other thing in my life, if I look back on my teaching, I mean, the programs for conscience were very important, but I think even more important than that is my kids got a sense of, damn, that guy sure does love me.
Bruce, I can't imagine that there would be anyone listening, conservative, liberal, or somewhere in between, that wouldn't accept your definition of what teachers do and should be doing as anything other than what we would all want for our children, what we would all want for our country.
Well, I want to, if I may say one or two other things about Julia. She and I have had a lifelong, deep, loving relationship. I was honored to be at her wedding. She shared with me the great pride she has in her husband and her two sons. Ken, just about a year and a half ago, my beloved mother-in-law died, and we had a celebration. And without announcement, Julia flew cross country to attend it. This is indicative of a student who has the finest and kindest relationship with her teacher. And so I'm profoundly in her debt. Will never be able to repay her for what she's taught and given me.
Hmm. Julie, a final thought?
Oh my goodness. Boy, right back at you, Bruce. I mean, I only wish that you would know how important you are to me.
Well, Bruce and Julie, I want to thank you both for being part of these podcasts. Bruce, thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to be with you and spend time with you and Julia, Ken.
And Bruce, I have to ask you, do you still have a copy of that index card that was in your wallet?
Oh, yeah.
Do you? Can you take a
Yeah.
picture of it and send
Sure.
it to me? Because I want to post it on our
Sure.
website for everyone to see it. I won't ask you to say what it says. I could imagine what it says, but we'll use that as an incentive for people to come to the website and see it.
It's faded, so I will darken it in.
Okay,
Okay.
great. Julia, thank you so much. It's always it makes these stories so much better when I don't just have a teacher, but I have a student who can describe the impact that a teacher had on their life, and you did it eloquently and beautifully and in such a touching way. So thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here.
You can find this podcast on our Teacher Stories website. That's teacherstories.org. And you can find it on our other podcast, Courageous Conversations About Our Schools, which is at schoolconversations.org. And again, this and all of our episodes are available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. So long, everyone.